PF is a research-based event. We should be doing research. We should be reading books. This is a book about strategic nuclear sharing by Julian Schofield, who is a very famous international relations scholar in the literature. And I am going to read it today. This might sound crazy, but when I was a PFer, I would go on runs and like look for podcasts about the topic, whatever, especially during camp, which a lot of people are currently attending. And I wished that someone would just like read me evidence, like read evidence out loud, and I could listen to it and sort of through osmosis understand the topic better. That is what I am here to do. This is going to be very outlandish, but in this video, I'm going to get through as much of this book as possible before I burn out. Just reading it out loud to you. So you can go ahead and like, I don't know, put this on 2 times speed or something, put in your earbuds, go on your run, and just start learning about how nuclear sharing works and the sort of strategies behind it, the theory behind it. I think this will be incredibly good evidence, incredibly applicable to the topic, and this is really like this is the actual expert stuff that is out there, rather than like whatever the stuff people are actually citing as cards. Fairly recent too. This is 2014, and from one of the leading experts. So let's get right into it. All right, reading time with Mac. Let's do it. Chapter 1, Introduction, Nuclear Sharing and Why More May Be Better. We don't expect states to share nuclear weapons, their technology, or their delivery systems because of the difficulty the donor has in assuring the reliability of the recipient state. Nevertheless, nuclear sharing has occurred in a number of instances. It started with France, the UK, and the US, then continued with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan during the Second World War, the US and its NATO allies, the USSR and China, France, Israel, and South Africa, and China and Pakistan. On a lesser scale, other states have also acted to counter to the conventional wisdom and shared expertise that enhanced the nuclear capability of recipient states. Most nuclear sharing occurs between allies, but the overwhelming numbers of allies do not share nuclear weapons. Whether they do so depends to a large extent on the prevailing strategic incentives to share, particularly whether adversaries have tacitly negotiated an agreement to manage their competitive nuclear diffusion, whether the allies are democratic, and the stability of their domestic decision-making processes. Historically, only grave security threats are likely to overrule the reluctance of states to share the sensitive technology of the most powerful weapons. Iron, which Pliny described as the most useful and most fatal instrument in the hand of man, was the preeminent capital weapon of pre-modern times, and its sharing was prohibited by most societies, from the Hittites and the Philistines to Charlemagne. States are concerned that allies they equip with nuclear weapons may become less compliant, but donor states are far more concerned that the technology will spread to enemies, or that not giving it to allies will cause a friendly alliance to collapse, or that proliferation may lead to instability and escalate to a general war. As part of the 1968 to 1995 Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, nuclear weapon states promised not to assist non-nuclear weapon states to obtain nuclear weapons, that's Article 1, who in turn promised not to receive nuclear weapons, which is Article 2. The 1987 Missile Technology Control Regime, or MTCR, is explicit in its purpose of seeking to reduce the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, by reducing their methods of delivery, and stipulates that states must presume against exports of missiles whose purpose is WMD delivery. These widely ratified multilateral treaties give the impression that because nuclear sharing is a violation of international law, that there is therefore little trade in nuclear weapons. However, nuclear weapons have been shared, and my goal is to explain the conditions under which this occurs. The definition of what enables nuclear weapons capability must be broad, because theoretically segregating nuclear warheads and missiles in a study of the diffusion of power in the international system is neither historically accurate nor strategically insightful. States routinely coordinate their nuclear weapons and missile programs to coincide. No state has invested in missile technology for space exploration that has not also had, at some point, a strategic interest in obtaining at least the reserve capacity to launch nuclear weapons. Sharing nuclear weapons entails considering not simply the nuclear warheads, but also the materials, fissile, and otherwise, the technology, the manufacturing capability, and the delivery means, including missiles, bombers, and submarines, and in effect, anything that contributes to or enhances a nuclear military capability. A fission demonstration device without a means of delivery may be worse than useless, creating vulnerability, instability, and incentives for preventive attack. Nuclear sharing is the deliberate or permissive transfer between a donor and a recipient state of resources that facilitate a military nuclear capability with the intention of effecting a change in the strategic environment of the international system or for the purpose of bartering for vital resources. Negligence is excluded, but permissiveness, when a donor state could otherwise have stopped proliferation, is not. Permissiveness may give the recipient state the capacity to manufacture or use nuclear weapons. The assumption here is that the nuclear donor has superior technical ability to the nuclear recipient, although the dynamics of nuclear sharing apply to partnerships as well. Nuclear sharing in this context consists of the creation of human capital, direct transfer of nuclear fuels and fissile explosives, associated command and control technology or delivery vehicles. Sharing of nuclear weapons is a relative measure of assistance, and placed on a linear scale approaches the other extreme of active non-proliferation. At the middle of the scale are permissive policies that allow proliferation where it otherwise could have been slowed, such as between the US and Israel and Pakistan, or the US and the Soviet Union with regard to China and India, respectively. It has been demonstrated that states receiving nuclear assistance can accelerate and economize their own nuclear efforts, such as by leapfrogging technology. Other forms of diffusion, typically inadvertent, such as through espionage, capture, observation of the isotope debris of nuclear tests, or commercial exchange of dual use applications by state or non state actors, are far slower. The benefits of sharing vary between states. Some, such as China, Pakistan, and South Africa, were initially heavily dependent on foreign providers for their enrichment capacity, and sharing in those cases provided a significant fillip to their respective nuclear weapons programs. The overall findings of this book are that the most common reason that states do not share is because of agreements between adversarial donors not to share, followed by fears that proliferation will sunder an alliance, that states will lose their influence over others, and finally because of the dangers of escalation. In the rare instances in which nuclear sharing does occur, states most often share nuclear weapons for reasons of security. These reasons are subdivided into three categories. More often to make an ally safer than to encourage an ally does not bandwagon with an adversary, and finally to dissuade an ally from proliferating on their own. The second most common cause of nuclear sharing is for barter of vital resources, often also nuclear materials. Thirdly, nuclear sharing may be pursued to embolden a proxy state to threaten the sphere of influence of an adversary. States will only provide nuclear expertise to states in their own sphere of influence if they can render them permanently dependent. Democratic states are more likely to share with other democracies, and importantly, are more likely to share with the most significant nuclear technology: fusion warheads, sea launched ballistic missiles or SLBMs, and ballistic missile submarines or SSBMs. When states do share nuclear weapons, they are aware in principle that the regime stability of the recipient state is important, but in practice, this is a principle less often observed. Most decisions to share nuclear weapons are miscalculations, typically the result of fragmented domestic decision-making processes. Most political elites are not confident that possessing nuclear weapons will ensure peace, so are reluctant to share. Next, the easy deterrence model of nuclear sharing. In a 1982 monograph, Kenneth Waltz, famous guy, boldly asserted that the spread of nuclear weapons would lead to peace. His argument was simply that since nuclear weapons cannot be defended against, and secure second strike arsenals virtually guarantee a retaliatory strike more costly than any political gain, states would not rationally start wars that would lead to nuclear escalation. Nuclear weapons were also so immensely destructive that it would be difficult to misinterpret their devastating deterrent value. The political outcome is that nuclear arsenals preserve the status quo in the current international system. This argument is encapsulated by the easy deterrence model that argues nuclear weapons are robust deterrents against war. This approach is typified by early French theorists such as Pierre Gallois. In this conception, nuclear deterrence is relatively straightforward to achieve because the destructive power of nuclear weapons is so easily perceivable. According to Robert Jervis, another famous guy, nuclear weapons therefore reduce disputes and war and make preserving the status quo relatively easy. Nuclear weapons have not been found to be particularly useful as coercive instruments. It follows that a state's willingness to share nuclear weapons would be determined by its positioning within the international system. States that benefit from the maintenance of the status quo are therefore likely to permit the sharing of nuclear technology with any and all other states. States that seek to overturn the international order through coercion or war are therefore less likely to share nuclear weapons technology with potential adversaries. In addition, status quo states that require war to counter the erosion of their position in the international system are also unlikely to share nuclear weapons technology with non-nuclear states that are the engine or the beneficiaries of this deterioration. It is important to test these propositions because they can be deduced from the widespread belief that nuclear deterrence is robust because nuclear retaliation and escalation are incredibly dangerous, especially since nuclear weapon states share very rarely. Furthermore, states challenging the international system are as likely to share nuclear weapons as the established powers because nuclear weapons can be used to blunt intervention and impair extended deterrence. Furthermore, aspiring or new nuclear states are often hostile to non-proliferation policies which have been directed against them by the world's established powers, and for an initial period at least, advocate the right of states to proliferate counter to these prohibitions. Finally, significant security threats can cause donor states to think in the short term, although by proliferating, established powers may create new challengers, while challengers may create adversaries to their expansion. The easy deterrence sharing model makes two major assumptions that may explain its failure to predict the rarity of nuclear sharing. First, that the destructive power of nuclear weapons makes deterrence robust, and second, that states have a status quo orientation. In fact, either or both may be untrue. First, the power of nuclear weapons may not be as absolute as suggested by Bernard Brodie, with some scholars arguing that the historical influence of nuclear weapons has been exaggerated. For John Mearsheimer, nuclear weapons cannot guarantee security because the stability-instability paradox undermines deterrence. Standoffs between second strike arsenals neutralize the threat of escalation, paradoxically making lower level interstate conflict safe from escalation. Second, states may be reluctant to share nuclear weapons because the international system is populated not by status quo defensive positionalists, but by states seeking hegemony. States seeking to dominate the international system will be less likely to cede counterbalancing nuclear arsenals. Next, the puzzle. The puzzle of Waltz's more may be better is that it is theoretically compelling, yet empirically inaccurate and normatively terrifying. The overwhelming majority of states have not shared nuclear weapons, and yet if their decision makers accept that nuclear war is unwinnable, then they should accept his dictum. The purpose of this book is to examine competing explanations to see which best explains why Waltz's proposition that states could be expected to share nuclear weapons is wrong. This theoretical response to the easy deterrence model is conducted in two parts. Chapter 2 surveys three explanations for why states do not share nuclear weapons. Chapter 3 proposes an explanation for why states share that is different from Waltz's rationale. Next, the organization of the book. The book is organized as follows. Chapter 2 examines why states generally do not share nuclear weapons, and Chapter 3 proposes a security calculus model that better explains why they do. Chapter 4 develops an explanation for the rarity of nuclear sharing by examining the incidence of nuclear non-proliferation bargains between adversaries. Chapter 5 provides a brief synopsis of nuclear cooperation during the Second World War, and Chapter 6 summarizes the cases of nuclear sharing refusals. Chapters 7 through 12 examine the nuclear sharing cases of France and Israel, USSR and China, US and NATO, Israel and South Africa, China and Pakistan and North Korea. Chapter 13 surveys cases of sharing motivated by soft balancing. Chapter 14 evaluates the theoretical findings and implications for nuclear non-proliferation. Chapter 2 Theories of Nuclear Non-Sharing. States overwhelmingly do not share nuclear weapons. In order to understand under what circumstances states do share nuclear weapons, there must be a contrast with the incentives not to do so. There are three explanations for why, and these are in sequence, that decision makers believe that nuclear deterrence is unstable, that states do not willingly surrender their influence over other states, and that states are restrained from sharing by negotiated non-proliferation bargains. These are termed the elusive deterrence, the intervention, and the non-proliferation bargain models. The elusive deterrence model of nuclear non-sharing. The elusive deterrence model, typified by Scott Sagan's study of the organizational weakness of nuclear deterrence forces and policies, highlights the danger that nuclear deterrence may fail. Nuclear weapons do not guarantee deterrence and peace, and states are therefore very reluctant to share nuclear weapons except with very close and reliable allies. This model is also skeptical of the accuracy of rational deterrence theory. New historical evidence seems to suggest that nuclear weapons have had a far less deterrent effect, particularly in major disputes, than has been widely assumed. The evidence contradicting the easy deterrence or nuclear sharing model suggests that elites do not have confidence that nuclear weapons are absolute or that their deterrence is robust. The recent statistical evidence is that nuclear asymmetry is associated with an increased probability of interstate disputes, use of force, fatalities, and war. Recent statistical evidence seems to vindicate Sagan and the elusive deterrence model, which implies that nuclear weapons are not a pacifying force at lower levels of escalation, and that rather than discouraging conflicts, such weapons compact them into the lower scales of violence. The fragility of nuclear deterrence may also be because it is unclear to decision makers whether nuclear weapons favor the offense or the defense. Nuclear weapons have not, therefore, eliminated great power interventions. They've merely increased their costs. Status quo states, especially if they are risk averse, are unlikely to support the spread of nuclear weapons, which are the ultimate offensive weapon against which there is no defense, and which may be launched through miscalculation. How states think about nuclear sharing tells us a lot about how states regard the utility of nuclear weapons and the possibility of nuclear war. Not all nuclear arsenals, even mature ones, deliver equivalently robust deterrence. Secure second strike capabilities, comprising thousands of thermonuclear warheads and ballistic missile delivering submarines, are expensive and therefore the preserve of the great powers, and have had a far more decisive impact on international politics than lesser arsenals. Small nuclear forces are capable of far more limited dissuasion. Decision makers that share this perspective of scalable nuclear power do not recognize the existence of absolute weapons, nor any logical limit to the number of nuclear weapons that are required. In part, this is because while counter-value targets are limited to the number of cities, counter-force military targets are nearly unlimited in number. Thousands of warheads are needed for counter-force attacks, since some believe that this is the only way to end a nuclear war, for the high expenditure rates of tactical nuclear war, and to create the general deterrent awe that preserves the exclusive status of the five fusion warhead possessing great powers. Nuclear weapons were not originally designed for deterrence, but for attack, and their deterrent application had to be learned from within the specific geopolitical and strategic circumstances of the Cold War. The Russo-Soviet interpretation of nuclear weapons, developed in the context of defending against Nazi Germany's attempted genocide of European Russia, emphasizes the fungible and tangible contribution nuclear weapons can make to the full scope of security. The Soviet Union believed nuclear war was controllable and winnable, that nuclear weapons brought status, and that nuclear weapons were well suited to tactical nuclear war. Similarly, the US by the mid 1970s also believed that nuclear war could be controllable and winnable as part of its Schlesinger doctrine that rejected mutually assured destruction. The US also recognized the importance of being able to respond at the tactical nuclear level and recognized the status benefits of nuclear weapons, particularly as they apply to general deterrence. These understandings of the utility of nuclear weapons are also the basis for the liberal argument about the importance of the regime type of the donor and the recipient state. According to Sagan, certain regimes, such as authoritarian governments or new democracies, are more likely to go to war, which reduces confidence that some nuclear weapons equipped states will behave with restraint. Also, donor states will not share nuclear weapons with states whose internal instability could either undermine deterrence, cause the recipient to turn against the donor, or lead to a further unfavorable proliferation of nuclear weapons. Failed states should not therefore be the recipient of nuclear weapon assistance. US concerns with proliferation in the 1950s and the 1960s were raised precisely around questions of the reliability of command and control in developing states, particularly where historical, ideological, or religious considerations could distort a political elite's perception of the utility of nuclear threats and force. Next, the intervention model of nuclear denial. The intervention model of nuclear denial argues that nuclear sharing is rare because states are sensitive to the loss of influence over both allies and adversaries when nuclear weapons capacity is proliferated. Nuclear weapons provide an easy deterrent against conventionally backed coercive diplomacy, and nuclear proliferation disproportionately favors the resistance of weak states against the influence attempts of the stronger states. States have strong preferences for providing extended deterrence instead. The stronger states are therefore more sensitive to the influence curtailment effects of the sharing of nuclear weapons, and thus more supportive of non-proliferation. Matthew Kronig has found that the potential of a nuclear donor state's ability to project power against another state is inversely related to its likelihood of sharing nuclear weapons technology. For example, to constrain the use of nuclear energy technology for weapons applications, the US and the USSR both required client states to sign contracts requiring some level of safeguarding of their facilities. States are not therefore expected to help other states obtain nuclear weapons. States are not concerned that withholding nuclear weapons will alienate a potential recipient, since by definition, any adverse reaction indicates the recipient would not have been a reliable ally. States are also reluctant to share with recipients that could turn against them, including current allies. Nuclear armed states are also concerned for the resilience of the nonproliferation regime, which protects their relative influence and their general deterrent awe. States may nevertheless share under very limited circumstances, when donor and recipients face a common enemy, and when sharing increases the donor state's relative power compared to a third party. The intervention model's primary value is in contributing to the explanation of the large number of non-sharing cases and non-events. The vast majority of states are not seeking nuclear weapons, typically because they either lack the interest or do not wish to make the public expenditure. Of the far fewer remaining cases of states that are seeking nuclear weapons, their typical motives are security or status intertwined with domestic political compulsions to demonstrate national viability. The intervention model argues that in this much smaller subgroup of potential proliferation cases, donor states do not wish to see their relative influence decline in circumstances where there is no compelling security need to share. The main competing explanation for non-sharing in this cohort of cases is that donor states willingly bargained restrictions on nuclear sharing with adversaries to avert proliferation races. This will be elaborated in Chapter 3. There are three logical shortcomings with the intervention model. First, the model's prediction of a loss of influence as a disincentive for nuclear sharing assumes that there is little political distinction between large and small arsenals. A nuclear power equipped with a diversified triad of intercontinental countervalue assets will suffer little loss of influence over a state equipped with fission warheads deployed on intermediate range ballistic missiles, IRBMs, stored in a warehouse, however much of a political nuisance it is. Second, it is not clear that nuclear-backed influence is fungible or whether it has been demonstrated in historical cases, even under conditions of nuclear superiority. If such influence is so powerful, why has it been unable to dissuade states from proliferating in the first instance? States resist nuclear compellence for the same reason that they resist conventional compellence. Any concession undermines the state's reputation and exposes it to further exploitation. Therefore, seeking to preserve influence over other states by nuclear means may be chimerical. Third, if the potential donor state is perceived to be aggressively enforcing nonproliferation or withholding nuclear sharing with an ally, it could provoke the ally to seek nuclear weapons elsewhere or by other means, with an overall worsening of relations. Donor states can actually share nuclear weapons with recipients to increase their own influence, as the Soviet Union attempted with China in 1956 and as the US did with its British and French allies. A state might thereby be reducing its ability to intervene against a state, but it also reduces the influence of other potential interveners. A loss of relative power does not always result in a loss of influence or a loss of compliance or security, but the opposite, and it can improve the willingness of allies to cooperate. The intervention model explains donor behavior best within its own sphere of influence. Without a calculus to determine how states trade off influence for other interests, the intervention model is left with the trivial observation that donors will not arm their potential enemies. Duh. Furthermore, there is a simpler alternative explanation that accounts for the same outcome of a reluctance to share, which is that states avoid nuclear proliferation because they believe that nuclear deterrence is fragile, that nuclear arms races are both probable and can escalate to war, and that nuclear war is costly. States are therefore less concerned about a loss of influence than they are of an escalation that could engulf them, typically through their being targeted or chain ganged into a nuclear exchange. Next, cooperation, non-proliferation. When adversaries agree to stop sharing the bomb. The intervention model of nuclear denial, which argues that states do not share nuclear weapons because they want to preserve their ability to intervene in other states, explains most potential recipient cases that are within a donor's immediate sphere of influence, and donors not under a security threat. States under security threats have significant incentives to share, but choose not to share primarily because of non-proliferation bargains, not because they want to preserve their ability to intervene. The intervention model gives the impression that donor states are disproportionately preoccupied with denying their allies and neutral states nuclear expertise, when there are grave risks of interfering with the nuclear procurement of an ally. The underlying logic that argues that states place more importance on their relative influence than their relative security fails to account for those cases where states share quite willingly with allies. Rather, the principal cause of the paucity of nuclear sharing in the international system is the implicit threat of runaway nuclear sharing, also termed nuclear proliferation races. Nuclear proliferation races threaten the security of the donor states and significantly increase the probability of nuclear war by flooding the international system with a multitude of underdeveloped and unstable nuclear arsenals. As the proliferation race proceeds and proxies become scarcer, donors will more desperately seek less and less stable candidates, dangerously increasing the likelihood of escalation to nuclear war. Donor states will therefore choose to pursue joint and cooperative non-proliferation strategies with their adversaries under three conditions. First, when attempts to spread nuclear weapons to their allies provoke a counter response by their adversary. Second, when their allies seek independent policies to respond to adversaries, but when those policies undermine the donor state's nuclear strategy to oppose that same adversary. And third, when the technology has or is threatening to spread to third parties and a settlement in one security domain can be achieved for the mutual advantage of two donors, allowing them to refocus their attention elsewhere. Important cases of this phenomenon include the US Soviet, US Chinese, and minor Soviet Chinese non-proliferation bargains. States typically realize the likelihood of a proliferation race once they have embarked on nuclear sharing, and their adversary has also retaliated by sharing. During the Second World War, members of the French scientific establishment passed knowledge of the theory of nuclear weapons to the UK, which in turn passed it on to the US. There was little consideration among the French or English at the time for the consequences of their relative loss of influence over the US. States are far more afraid of hostile states possessing nuclear weapons than of the loss of nuclear influence over their allies. Whether states are concerned about their loss of influence among other states and allies, rather than with confronting the emerging threat, is a function not of a state's size, but of its inclination to free ride, and to what extent it is favored by the current distribution of benefits in the international system. The intervention model of nuclear sharing exaggerates the importance states place on reserving the ability to maintain influence over their allies, and exaggerates the number of non-events it explains. Most averted sharing is deterred by the threat of proliferation races, not the desire of the donor state to dominate over its allies, which by definition is a form of bandwagoning and merely provokes them into proliferating or counterbalancing. Sharing is a fairly common expectation by minor allied states, which do not typically appreciate the consequences it has for the donor state, particularly in the reaction sharing provokes among the donor state's adversaries. Despite the fact that national nuclear forces were being sought as a means to enhance foreign policy autonomy, the French, like the British and the Chinese, initially solicited and expected assistance from their respective superpower allies. During the Fifth Republic, French nuclear policy was similar to British policy inasmuch as France sought an independent nuclear capability mainly as a complement to, rather than a substitute for, the collective security that the US strategic deterrent supplied for its NATO allies. Failure to secure a nuclear weapon had for all three states strained relations with their potential donor for a number of years. Donor states do not share nuclear weapons technology frivolously. Typically, donor states share with the recipient states that have attained a preliminary technical capacity. This is not because the recipient has satisfied the ability to securely manage its nuclear weapons, many do not, but because it demonstrates over time their restraint and the fact that it's going nuclear is being gradually accommodated by other states in the system. Most nuclear breakouts were anticipated, with India's 1974 peaceful nuclear explosive (P&E) being a notable exception. Thus, the US transferred nuclear technology to France from 1972, knowing that the Soviet Union would not later retaliate against the outcome because it has already come to expect a nuclear-armed France. Chapter 4 demonstrates that the non-proliferation bargain prepositions describe the thinking of states better than the intervention model proposition. If a state is concerned about losing its ability to intervene against other states, or more conservatively, is concerned about fending off another state's intervention, this indicates that the intervention model proposition is in play. If the observed indicator is the donor fearing a cycle of retaliation, then the non-proliferation bargain proposition is a better explanation. Next, shortcomings of the mainstream explanations. In the 30 years since Waltz's seminal work, a great deal of historical evidence and concerted analysis has made its key assumptions much less secure. Nuclear weapons may be absolute weapons, but their deterrent effect is uncertain, if not fragile. However, his insight cannot explain why states are prominently reliant on nuclear deterrence for their security, and that there persists instances of nuclear sharing, presumably because nuclear weapons serve as a reliable deterrent. Though the elusive deterrence sharing model better predicts the rarity of nuclear sharing, it does not predict either why so many weakly allied states share or when states do share nuclear military technology. It cannot account for nuclear assistance in the Israel, South Africa, and China-Pakistan cases in which the receiving regimes had questionable national viability. The intervention model of nuclear denial similarly underestimates when states share. The underlying logic that argues that states place more importance on their relative influence than on their relative security fails to account for those cases where states share quite easily with allies. My purpose in the next chapter is to present a model that accounts for those instances in which states do share nuclear weapons or their related technology. Chapter 3: The Theory of Nuclear Sharing. Nuclear weapons are exceptionally powerful instruments. If a given security threat is great enough, or the promise of a commercial exchange lucrative enough, states will share nuclear weapons related technologies. Even so, states will not share nuclear weapons with recipients in their spheres of influence unless there is a compelling security threat and the recipient states are subject to a relationship characterized by permanent dependency. Consequently, nuclear sharing with non-dependent states is more likely to be conducted with geographically distant and dependent proxies, in some cases opposing a powerful common adversary. An overwhelmingly hostile common adversary may lead to a state's giving assistance to a close ally, but usually an extended deterrent is the preferred posture. States will not share nuclear weapons technology when opposed by an adversary that will retaliate by confronting the donor state directly rather than the proxy state. Donor states have a tendency to miscalculate if their security decision-making processes are particularly narrow or if their decision-making memberships are unstable. I propose a security calculus model that is superior to the competing explanations in three respects. It accounts for the rarity of nuclear proliferation that the easy deterrence model does not. It improves the specification of the elusive deterrence model by clarifying the issues of regime stability and democracy in recipient states, and it improves on the intervention model's explanation for why states do not share. The calculus model is falsified if, broadly, established nuclear powers proliferate most frequently, and states are more concerned that sharing will reduce their influence than that it will provoke retaliation by an adversary. The underlying framework of this explanation draws on the logic of balance of power theory, and in particular, the logic of exploiting third-party behavior within the international system. A neo-realist explanation of nuclear sharing would state that in an anarchic self-help system, states will exercise power to attain their national interest, the most important element of which is security. Nuclear weapons, which represent an especially significant source of power, can contribute to security. Unit level characteristics, such as regime type, have little effect, so that there can be no particular advantage of or increased likelihood of sharing between democracies. Cooperation is difficult but not unattainable. With nuclear weapons minimizing the payoffs accruing to defectors, the ease of sanctioning violators by a major power can overcome the cost of collective action, supposing that they can be detected. If states are more concerned about relative than absolute gains, they may risk nuclear war if it increases their power ranking, although the complexity of a multipolar nuclear environment makes any war outcome uncertain. Defensive realism would argue that states are defensive positionalists, and since nuclear weapons favor the status quo, states benefiting from the current distribution of payoffs in the international system would favor receiving and sharing nuclear weapons. In contrast, offensive realists would argue that great powers seek hegemony, and nuclear weapons raise the cost of incorporating smaller nuclear armed states. Therefore, offensive realism predicts that states will inhibit nuclear proliferation. Mearsheimer's observation that hegemony is a property of a given region, subdivided by strategically significant water barriers, is consistent with the way that proliferation undermines the influence of regional hegemons. States rarely share nuclear weapons, but when they do so for compelling security or commercial gains, and do it with care to avoid diminishing their sphere of influence or provoking a retaliatory move from any adversary also affected by the consequences of nuclear sharing. The unexpected outcome is that nuclear donor states are more likely to share with a distant neutral with which the state shares a common adversary rather than a close ally, even if it shares a similar ideology or political system. Next, varieties of nuclear sharing. Nuclear sharing consists of enabling nuclear weapons capability to a recipient state and occurs on an ascending scale of 3 degrees: basing, loaning, and giving. Basing, which is actually a form of extended nuclear deterrence, is the practice of the donor state deploying its nuclear weapons within the recipient state's territory. This form of extended deterrence is included in the nuclear sharing taxonomy because, for historical purposes, it provokes a similar reaction in target states, primarily because there are instances in which it is indistinguishable from other forms of nuclear sharing. Target states may believe that basing is a preliminary step towards a handover of nuclear weapons, or that there is a considerable risk that nuclear weapons may be seized by the hosting state. The US reaction to the Soviet basing of missiles in Cuba in 1962 indicates the sensitivity of foreign nuclear basing, especially in the spheres of influence of other states. There was a worry in the US that Cuba could seize Soviet missiles. The Soviet worry that US nuclear warheads based in Germany would be made available to Bonn was realized. The second degree of nuclear sharing is loaning, which comes in two forms: individual loaning, in which a donor state loans nuclear weapons to a recipient state, and alliance loaning, in which a donor loans nuclear weapons to a recipient alliance. Loaning may be covert, but has historically been highly visible, though opaque in its precise procedures. An example of individual loaning is the unique arrangement the US had with its NATO allies, in which custodial US nuclear weapons under dual key arrangements would be made available in time of war and in accordance with the policy of NATO's military committee. A lesser example was the Soviet Union's custody of Warsaw Pact tactical nuclear weapons that could have been used by the Warsaw Pact armies. An example of alliance loaning was the unique and never realized early 1960s US proposal for a multilateral nuclear force, or MLF, in which nuclear weapons would be loaned to a collective alliance body. Loaning can also be distinguished in terms of what is being loaned, and typically the most common distinction is between tactical nuclear weapons, or T&W, such as artillery shells, tactical rocketry, surface-to-air missiles, air-dropped bombs, atomic demolitions munitions, depth charges, and torpedoes, and theater weapons, which can include nuclear-armed long-range missiles and aircraft capable of conducting counter-value strikes against distant adversaries. There have been no instances of strategic nuclear weapons being loaned. For example, UK possession of the Polaris and Trident Sea Launched Ballistic Missile, or SLBMs, was not on the basis of a loan. The final degree of nuclear sharing is giving, of which there are three subcategories: soft sharing, giving of emerging nuclear weapons technology, and giving of capital nuclear weapons technology. Soft sharing is nuclear sharing propelled by soft balancing motives. Soft balancing occurs when states are too weak to oppose a threat and also reject alliances to avoid provoking that threat. Instead, these states erode the power of the target state by proliferating nuclear weapons capability below the threshold of response of the target state or international institutions responsible for stopping nuclear proliferation. For example, a state may, in compliance with the regulations of the International Atomic Energy Agency, legally share nuclear enrichment technologies with other states that are in a position to weaken the target state's influence. Russian nuclear energy assistance to Iran is an example of soft sharing. Emerging nuclear weapons technology consists of fission warheads, bombers, and short to intermediate range rocketry, whereas capital nuclear weapons technology consists of weapons associated with the great powers, such as fusion warheads and rocketry with a global reach. Giving may be overt, but because of the risk of provoking a nuclear proliferation race, it is typically conducted covertly. The state may decide to provide a plausibly deniable small amount of assistance, or decide, when it has the capacity to do so, of not stopping nuclear proliferation to a particular recipient state. This overlap between nuclear sharing and the background dynamics of nuclear proliferation is important because often a state will provide an initial fillip to a nuclear weapons program, intending to create sufficient momentum that the recipient state can make up the shortfall, as in the China-Iran and China-Pakistan cases. Sharing nuclear weapons comprises many components. States may provide raw uranium ore, U-238, which is more common than silver in the Earth's crust, sold for approximately $20 a kilogram in 2013, milled uranium ore, or yellow cake, UF6, uranium hexafluoride for ease of processing, or varying enrichment levels of uranium from its natural state of 0.711% U-2235 to a minimum of 93% for weapons grade. Enrichment expertise may be shared. Gaseous diffusion is the most common, accounting for over half of the world's capacity, and consists of forcing gaseous U-238 through small holes. It is rapidly being replaced by gas centrifuge technology, where isotopes are separated by density on magnetically mounted centrifuges. Other methods include calutrons, using electromagnetic separation, jet nozzle, which is a high velocity version of a centrifuge, and various chemical isotope separation techniques. There is also experimental interest in liquid thermal diffusion and laser isotope separation. States may give plutonium, which is manufactured in reactors by bombarding U-238 with low-energy neutrons, after which the desirable plutonium-239 is separated from the remaining isotopes. It takes a 30 megawatt non-thermal reactor 1 day of operating to produce between zero point 0.9 and 1 grams of plutonium. A reliable plutonium-239 warhead needs a minimum purity of 93%. Worldwide, there are approximately 2,000 tons of plutonium in civilian use and about 150 tons in military use, with the minimum practical critical mass required for a warhead being 5 kilograms. There is a debate about whether the uranium or plutonium fuel cycle is less expensive. However, uranium is better suited to nuclear artillery, it is easier to machine, and it has better longevity, whereas plutonium can be detonated at a much smaller critical mass, but is prone to hazardous subcritical detonation if allowed to concentrate. States may provide a variety of reactors, but in particular, the heavy water and the breeder reactors are best suited for producing plutonium and are hence the target of anti-proliferation efforts. Among the most important warhead components are beryllium for neutron deflection and lithium deuteride or deuterium and tritium for fusion warhead fuel, explosive lenses to generate the plasma for implosion, and durable maraging steel for a wide variety of applications. Supercomputers are also in high demand for design work, miniaturization, and longevity tests. Delivery vehicles for nuclear weapons are often as expensive as the warheads themselves. From 1945 to 1994, the US spent $409 billion on warhead assembly and over $3.2 trillion on nuclear weapons deployment. Nazi Germany spent as much on its V1 and V2 program as the US did on the Manhattan Project, approximately $2 billion US dollars. States can give bombers a variety of missiles and rocket manufacturing resources, sounding rockets for research, space launch vehicles, gyroscopes for guidance, TELs, SSBNs, and geodetic targeting equipment. The nuclear forces associated with the great powers are qualitatively different and an order of magnitude more powerful than the nuclear arsenals of emerging nuclear states. This distinction between the arsenals of emerging nuclear states and capital nuclear weapons is the significant threshold between, on the one hand, fission weapons and intermediate range delivery systems, and on the other hand, fusion warheads, intercontinental ballistic missiles or ICBMs, nuclear powered ballistic missile submarines (SSBNs), sea launched ballistic missiles (SLBMs), and exotic weapons like fractional orbital bombardment systems. Where a fission warhead may produce a detonation equivalent of 15 kilotons of TNT, destroying approximately 16 square kilometers, and a tritium-boosted fission warhead can peak at 50 kilotons, thermonuclear, using the principle of hydrogen fusion, warheads can exceed 100 million tons of TNT of explosive power. As of 2013, the only states that have demonstrated an ability to set off a fusion warhead are the US, Russia, the UK, China, and France, though Israel may also have the capability. Only the US, the UK, and France have shared thermonuclear warhead designs, although Israel is accused of having stolen crytons from the US to build one, and China is accused of having stolen a copy of a US W-888 warhead in the 1990s. An example of a capital nuclear weapon is the now retired US LGM 118 MX intercontinental ballistic missile, which could deliver 10 warheads over 9,600 kilometers to within 120 meters of their targets 50% of the time at an inbound velocity of 7 kilometers per second. States do give nuclear technology, but sharing expertise for capital weapons is exceptional and is limited to the Soviet Union and China in 1956 and 1958, the US and UK from 1958, US and France from 1972, Germany and Israel from 1998, and Russia and India from 1988 to 1991. In these cases, the donor states provided ballistic missile submarine technology, a Gulf SSB capable of launching SLBMs in the case of Soviet Union and China, a modified Type 209 submarine capable of launching nuclear-armed cruise missiles in the case of the German-Israeli relationship, and facilitative training in nuclear-powered submarines in the case of the Russian assistance to India's Arihant SSBN. In addition, the US supplied crytons permitted Israel to develop thermonuclear weapons. French MD-620 rockets permitted Israel to develop its Jericho 2 missiles. French assistance helped Israel build its plutonium reprocessing plant. South African uranium and test facilities at Prince Edward Island provided reactor fuel, and Israel's 1979 nuclear test confirmation and access to U.S. research centers very likely gave Israel access, at a minimum, to aspects of warhead designs and nuclear test data. Next, when states share. States share nuclear weapons for up to three reasons: for barter, to obtain vital resources; to improve the security of a recipient state or alliance, which in turn improves the security of the donor; and, with distant proxies, to undermine the spheres of influence of adversaries. First, sharing for barter. States may sell nuclear technology for profit, or may trade or share nuclear technology in exchange for vital resources or for nuclear technology they do not have. States will barter nuclear technology if the outcome leads them to be better off in terms of relative power in the international system. In fact, many of the cases of nuclear assistance could probably be characterized as asymmetric pooling of resources, such as the cases of nuclear sharing between the USSR and China with regards to Soviet access to Chinese uranium, France and Israel, Israel and South Africa, and the US and UK. Historically, states have bartered most commonly for uranium ore, U-238, enriched uranium, U-235, heavy water, deuterium and tritium, enrichment technologies, rocket technology, technical knowledge relating to a reactor operation, warhead design, and nuclear test data, as well as a variety of specialized components such as lithium deuteride, beryllium, or maraging steel. Second, sharing for security. Donor states will share nuclear expertise to improve the security of a recipient state or alliance, if it in turn improves the security of the donor. The decision to share occurs as a consequence of a logical sequence of analysis undertaken by the decision makers of the donor state. In so doing, states are consciously sacrificing some portion of their power in order to increase their security, and are calculating that circumstances exist in which sharing is a better course of action than the alternative policy of withholding nuclear expertise. The logical sequence begins in the first instance with a nuclear or non-nuclear threat, direct or indirect, to the donor. The first policy decision is whether conducting an attack is both feasible and cost efficient. If the source of the threat is nuclear and anticipated, a preventive strike may be carried out. If an attack is infeasible, the next consideration is defense, which is only practical against first-generation systems such as bombers and missiles without penetration aids. The third step is establishing an extended nuclear deterrent against the threat. An extended deterrent may be sufficient to deter a target state, but if the threatened state is unsatisfied, it will seek to secure its own nuclear arsenal as a result. This may lead to preventive attack or retaliation by the adversary, or mutual suspicion may sunder an alliance. States will not impose sharing on reluctant borrowers, though there are exceptions. Political decision makers in Ottawa were averse to U.S. requests to nuclearize Canadian air defense. Denmark, excluding Greenland, and Norway rejected both basing and loaning of U.S. nuclear weapons during the Cold War. The aforementioned sequence defined the underlying necessary conditions for nuclear sharing for security purposes, which is that sharing is only offered to a recipient if, importantly, extended deterrence is not an acceptable solution to the recipient, and trivially, if both a preventive attack on the source of the threat and an extended defense are unavailable. Extended deterrence can be made unacceptable to the recipient state for historical reasons: the weakness of the donor. China's nuclear umbrella could not help Pakistan in either 1965 or 1971, or the unwillingness of donors to provide extended deterrence, as in the case of the US and apartheid South Africa. Donor states may also share nuclear weapons with recipient states in order to strengthen friendly states or alliances against threats. Donors may share nuclear weapons with recipients for immediate deterrence, to alleviate an imminent military threat of attack. Donors may also share to provide a recipient with a general deterrent advantage, achieving such an advantage in military power as to render hopeless any attempt by adversaries to even prepare themselves for offensive action, may reduce overall levels of hostility. The best example of this is Israel, where U.S. permissiveness toward the Israeli nuclear arsenal facilitated Tel Aviv's goal of securing general deterrence, thereby creating stability born of the realization by Israel's principal adversaries that there is no prospect of militarily defeating it. States can share nuclear weapons if, by doing so, they enable recipients to resist bandwagoning with an adversary, especially when extended deterrence and balancing are unavailable because of either geographic distance or deterrent incredibility. The Soviet Union's nuclear swaggering in the 1950s and 1960s was intended to compel Central European states into either inert neutrality or bandwagoning, neither of which was easily attainable against an alliance under a US nuclear umbrella. States may share nuclear weapons to keep a friendly state from acquiring its own independent nuclear arsenal. This is typically done to preserve an alliance, which may fragment if other states resent or fear the new nuclear power, as could arguably have been the case with a nuclear Germany or Japan. Donor states may do this by sharing smaller increments of nuclear technology, expertise, or weapons with proliferating recipient allies, ironically, as it reduces their incentives to proliferate on their own. US government officials did consider how nuclear sharing could alleviate a state's desire to obtain nuclear weapons, but concluded that there were too many different factors in each case to produce generalizations. Preventing another state from acquiring nuclear weapons may also permit a donor state to keep an adversary from retaliating against the arrival of a new nuclear state, and thereby trigger a proliferation race or undermine a non-proliferation bargain between adversarial donor states. Sharing nuclear weapons has four possible outcomes of considerable import. This seems important. First, it may cause the recipient state to turn on the donor. Second, it may cause the recipient state to turn on an ally of the donor. Third, it may lead the recipient state to become a donor to another recipient that is against the interest of the original donor. And fourth, it may provoke retaliatory behavior in the donor's principal adversary. There is a risk that the adversary may attack either the donor or the recipient state, but more likely it may retaliate by proliferating nuclear weapons. In many cases, potentially proliferating states forego nuclear weapons, anticipating the likely actions of the other states in the international system. Cuba and Taiwan are certainly wary of the danger of proliferating adjacent to their powerful neighbors. Sharing may have also been prohibited by a joint agreement between the donor and its adversary in order to limit the dangers of competitive nuclear proliferation. The advantages of sharing must compensate for these costs and externalities. Next, sharing with proxies. Third, a donor state may share nuclear weapons with a distant neutral state in order to infiltrate and disrupt an adversary's control over their geographic sphere of influence. An important component of balance of power politics are third-party states which can intervene and complicate the calculations of opposing countries. These candidate recipient states, termed proxies, conveniently located in or near the sphere of influence of an adversary, may be equipped with nuclear weapons by a donor state in order to distract the adversary. The presumption is that the donor state and proxy state share a common enemy. This is a viable strategy only when the nuclear assistance to the proxy is plausibly deniable and when the adversary does not retaliate against the donor state by triggering a nuclear proliferation race in which it equips its own group of recipient proxy states. The purpose of a proxy state is to absorb the attention and resources of the adversary and thereby lessen the adversary's effort focused on the donor state. The primary example of this is Beijing's support to Pakistan's pursuit of nuclear weapons in order to distract India from focusing on China. This usually implies some distance between the proliferator and the recipient, and therefore some limited strategic autonomy. Because of this reduction in control, states will never create these autonomous proxies in their own regional subsystem for fear of blowback, since two non-democratic nuclear powers and the same regional subsystem, unbound by an alliance against a common external threat, will become natural rivals. Because the primary desired effect is the distraction of the adversary, regime stability is less important. Proxies may or may not be available in a given strategic environment, but usually they lie at the seam between competing spheres of influence. This is a contentious proposition because it implies that the dynamics of international politics have not been fundamentally altered by the presence of nuclear weapons, as is commonly argued. Typical cases include Soviet nuclear assistance to China in the 1950s that blocked US inroads into Northeast Asia, and Chinese nuclear assistance to Pakistan in the 1970s, which undermined India's sphere of influence in South Asia. Next, conditions of nuclear sharing. Nuclear donor states typically impose three conditions for their nuclear sharing: dependency, typically by the loaning of nuclear weapons, exclusion from their sphere of influence, and the exclusion of capital weapons. The first condition is dependency. A donor state will, while trying to maximize its security by sharing, also seek to maximize the dependency of the recipient state, typically by only loaning nuclear weapons to the recipient. States believe that today's ally can be tomorrow's enemy and will therefore avoid blowback by reducing the autonomy of the recipient state's nuclear arsenal. The donor state will seek to render the recipient permanently dependent on the technology and weapon systems provided by the donor in such a way that if the donor withdrew its patronage, the state's weapon systems would be either significantly degraded or it would take a considerable time to replace them through the individual efforts of the recipient state. With dependence comes the possibility of nuclear reversibility in the event strategic circumstances change. Once the threat appears, nuclear weapons may be simply repatriated or local nuclear industries denied vital inputs. Dependency matters most for recipient states within a donor state's sphere of influence, less so for states in other regions. Dependency is not a desirable characteristic for a proxy state, since the proxy will be too directly associated with the donor state. The second condition is that the donor state will seek an especially binding dependency if the recipient state is in the same regional subsystem, for example, not blocked by a significant water barrier, as the proliferator. Donor states generally find it undesirable to share nuclear weapons with states within their spheres of influence unless the donor state is facing a significant threat to its security, and then the donor state only does so under the other two conditions of dependency and nuclear loaning. States put a premium on being the exclusive dominant power in their regional sphere of influence, and typically possess an advantage in power in that region that makes relying on other states for security advantages unnecessary. When there are exceptions, as there was in the case of the US equipping Canada with nuclear air defense missiles in order to protect against Soviet bombers, the other two subsequent conditions apply. This condition may be loosened for states like China with very limited or congested regional spheres of influence. I guess that's no longer the case in 2025. The third condition is that donor states will avoid equipping recipient states with capital weapons. An implicit assumption is that nuclear military power is scalable. The donor state's influence is maximized and blowback is minimized when the recipient state does not possess fusion warheads, ICBMs, SSBNs, SLBMs, or FOBs. These are the instruments of great powers and provide an order of magnitude greater firepower than either TNW or fission or boosted fission warheads, due mostly to their counter-value, city busting, and hence potentially genocidal capabilities. The comprehensive weaponization required to use a nuclear arsenal under effective command and control is significantly more expensive than simply building warheads. Tandem sphere thermonuclear weapons, in particular, need substantial testing or access to testing information and miniaturization in order to be deliverable. Their MIRVed, multiple independently targetable reentry vehicle deployment, and SLBMs on board SSBNs is significantly resource demanding. The implication is that nuclear sharing is therefore rare because the necessary conditions of geopolitical positioning and willing dependence by the recipient state hold so infrequently. States will not provide nuclear weapons to others to achieve a policy that they could achieve on their own, unless the recipient state is threatening to do so on its own. Next, nuclear sharing and miscalculation. Nuclear sharing is not without some miscalculation. On occasion, the rationality of the decision-making process of the donor state is compromised by structural or ideological distortions that facilitate the policy of nuclear sharing. Security decision-making elites typically have small memberships, which undermines their ability to conduct broad consultation and contributes to poor decision-making. There is evidence that in the France, Israel, Soviet China, and Pakistan Iran nuclear assistance dyads, the coherence of political decision making was compromised, and there had been no distortion, and had there been no distortion, rather, nuclear assistance would not have been provided. There is evidence of a lesser form of decision making distortion in the case of US and NATO and Soviet Cuba nuclear assistance also. One study argues that all states, before they come to adhere to a non-proliferation regime, make one critical mistake and help another state obtain nuclear weapons. States risk nuclear proliferation much more casually than they risk nuclear war, probably because there is a disbelief in the imminence of nuclear war. If many of the donor states examined in this book had better decision-making structures, there would have been considerably less nuclear sharing. The Chinese and Israeli nuclear efforts would have been significantly retarded, for example. A corollary of the liberal emphasis on the importance of domestic decision-making process is the expectation that democratic states are more likely to have a structurally and normatively supported level of trust that would more easily enable cooperation between donor and recipient states. Since democratic states would not expect other democracies to balance against it or use coercion to resolve disputes, nuclear proliferation among democracies would not reduce their relative influence or threaten their security. The US's dual key nuclear sharing arrangement with NATO does not seem conceivable if the alliance was not predominantly democratic, nor does the US UK French consultation on fusion warhead designs seem possible otherwise. Next, the test. The purpose of this book is to provide an explanation of why Waltz's more may be better prescription of nuclear proliferation is not descriptively accurate, given the assumptions of the absolute nature of nuclear weapons. Two central propositions of the easy deterrence sharing model will be tested on the case studies. That established major powers are more likely to enable nuclear proliferation, and that states seeking to overturn the international system are less likely to enable nuclear proliferation. The more may be better prescription is challenged by four models that seek to explain the rarity of nuclear sharing. The elusive deterrence sharing model argues that because of the fragility of deterrence, donor states will not share nuclear power with recipients that do not have stable domestic regimes and which do not appear viable. The intervention model of nuclear denial asserts that donor states are reluctant to share nuclear power for fear of a relative loss of their own power and making recipient states more resistant to their influence attempts. The cooperative non-proliferation bargain model argues that donor states will enter into non-proliferation bargains with their adversaries if doing so improves their security. The security calculus model argues a number of propositions. Donor states will barter nuclear power with other states if doing so improves their security. Donor states will share nuclear power in order to improve the security of the recipient states or alliance if the sharing in turn enhances the security of the donor under three circumstances. First, nuclear sharing strengthens a friendly state or alliance when extended deterrence is unacceptable to the recipient. Second, nuclear sharing strengthens a friendly state or alliance to keep it from bandwagoning when extended deterrence is unacceptable to the recipient. And third, limited nuclear sharing restrains a friendly state from proliferating when extended deterrence is unacceptable to the recipient. Furthermore, if there is no non-proliferation bargain between donors, donors will seek to share nuclear power with states under pressure to bandwagon from an adversary, particularly if the recipient is within the sphere of influence of that adversary. States seek to satisfy three conditions in the process of nuclear sharing. First, donor states will seek to make recipient states captive to a permanent relationship of dependence. Second, donor states will share nuclear power with recipient states in their spheres of influence only in exceptional circumstances and with a high degree of dependency on reversibly loaned nuclear power. Third, donor states will be very hesitant to provide capital and long-range nuclear power to recipient states. Finally, there are two propositions derived from the decision-making process itself. First, donor sharing decisions are prone to miscalculation because of the small size of and the low level of consultation obtained by security decision-making elites. Second, democratic donors are more likely to share nuclear power with democratic recipients. My purpose in the next chapter is to present a model that both explains the strong initial incentives states have to share, and more importantly, to account for how they come to the equilibrium of not sharing. The subsequent chapters examine cases of nuclear sharing and non-sharing. Next, cases and method. The hypotheses of the five models are tested by determining if the independent variables are operating in the prescribed direction in the universe of active cases of nuclear sharing, soft sharing, and salient non-sharing. These include the cases of the Second World War, the non-event cases of the nuclear refusals, France and Israel, Soviet Union and China, and the Warsaw Pact states, US and NATO, and major non-NATO allies, Israel and South Africa, China and Pakistan and North Korea, and Pakistan and Iran, North Korea and Libya, and the soft nuclear sharing cases of US and Israel, Russia and China and Iran, US and Russia and India, and other cases. The unit of analysis is the donor state's decision on how to approach an opportunity to share. Each case's context will be established both in terms of why anti-proliferation threats or extended deterrence was an unsatisfactory policy, and whether there was a non-proliferation bargain in place, and if so, why it was not sufficient as a restraint. These effects will be examined counterfactually to obtain variance on the independent variable. Measures of miscalculated nuclear sharing by political decision makers will be determined by seeing if there is evidence for post-sharing blowback or demonstrated donor regret. Case selection is guided by the fact that these are easy cases for the alternative explanations because all are of easy and elusive deterrence, and intervention models are frequently used to explain these outcomes. It therefore poses a hard case for the security calculus and the non-proliferation bargain models proposed in chapters 2 and 3. The impact of the variable should be judged in the context of the much greater number of cases of nuclear non-sharing than sharing. It is more difficult to explain why states share than why they do not. This study does not examine cases of sharing resulting from the pursuit of non-nuclear commercial profit, such as Germany's later rescinded agreement to build Brazil a complete fuel cycle in the 1970s, or difficult to avoidable espionage failures. There are indeed instances where purely commercial transfers of nuclear fuels and technology have given proliferation much greater impetus and had greater strategic impact than politically driven transfers. Examples include Canada's widespread sharing of can-do technology in the 1960s and 1970s, particularly to the Indian and Pakistan nuclear weapons programs, and Brazil's supply of 8 tons of uranium to Iraq in the 1980s. Another exclusion from this analysis is proliferation efforts between non-nuclear pure states, primarily because none have so far succeeded, even though in the long term their proliferation effect may be substantial. My purpose in the next chapter is to present a model that both explains the strong initial incentives states have to share, and more importantly, accounts for how they come to the equilibrium of not sharing. So then chapter 4 is nuclear proliferation races and non-proliferation bargains. But I think for this, I'm going to stop it here. I've reached about an hour of recorded content. We are 39 pages into the document out of like 100 more. No, it stops at like 100, doesn't it? Yeah, because all of these are citations. We are about 30 pages into like a 120, 130 page document. And even this is a bit of a facade because there are like, blank pages at the start. So we're making our way through the introductory bits. I probably will skip several of the case studies in the middle and then jump to the conclusion next time. Hopefully you found this valuable. I'm sure that the two people who have made it here will be very grateful to me. If you want me to do anything like this on other texts that you think are valuable to the topic in the future, or just other cards in general, I'm happy to. It's a bit of a weird experimental video, but hopefully people enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.